Let's talk about the pros and cons of Taekwondo. I happen to be a car person. I love cars. Got one of my car shirts on right now. And since 2016, I've bought 6 different cars. In fact, since 2020, I've bought a car every year. That involves trading in old ones as well. I really enjoy that for some reason. Wish I didn't. It's kind of a sickness. But anyway, what's interesting about cars is it illustrates perfectly that you can't have everything in one package. With engineering, you have to pick one thing and sacrifice another thing. It's very difficult to get something to do both things really, really well. And so, just like with cars, martial arts all depends on what you want to put your time into. And because you have limited time, you can't get good at everything on the field. You have to kind of pick what your preferences are. And that's why we have the different martial arts styles. You can choose where you want to focus your time. Now, just like with cars, if you try to make your focus too broad, you end up with nothing of any real particular value. You just aren't good at any one skill set enough to make it usable. So all cars also have to kind of narrow in their focus to some extent. They're getting better at making them all pretty well rounded, but to some extent they're still going to have to narrow their focus in. I'll give you an example. So I'm now parting with my 2018, it's a Fiat 124 Spider Abarth. It's a little sports car, and it's based on the Mazda Miata platform, if you know that car, but it's got its own Fiat engine and Italian design, even though it's built in a Japanese factory. So right there you're getting some interesting things because you've got the Italian flavorings with the Japanese reliability in the car industry. So it's kind of a neat mix. But I bring the car up because it's stiff, it's designed to be a very lightweight sports car, and it only has 164 horsepower, which gets the little thing to move around in a zippy fashion. It's just a fun little car, and I've absolutely loved owning the thing. Now I've switched it out for an older, actually, a 2014 Jaguar F-Type, and this thing is a whole nother animal. It weighs 1,500 pounds more, and it's got a whopping 495 horsepower. The thing is a monster. Now, is it a better car? It really just depends on what you want out of the experience. And actually, I could easily see someone preferring the little Fiat over this higher-end sports luxury car because it does still do some things just flat out better. One, it's cheaper to own. The tires, the maintenance, the amount of things that can go wrong on it, there's just a lot less to deal with the Fiat. So I'm hoping I didn't shoot myself in the foot too badly here. These are both second cars, by the way, so I don't have to worry about being stranded by either. Anyway, with the Fiat, because of its lighter weight, you also just get this incredible handling. I've never been in a vehicle that handles better than it. So if you're looking at just zipping around some curves, it's really hard to beat. It's just a great handling little car. It's also really fun because it only being 164 horsepower, you can string the thing all the way out. You can rev the engine way up, and you can shift through the gears in its manual mode, and you get to shift through a few gears before you hit the speed limit. And really you can use the car fully without breaking the law much. You know, you might go 5 over or something, but nothing that's going to get you in any trouble. Not so with the Jaguar. See, if you want to get that thing going in a populated area, it's like setting a firework off in the mall. It's not a good idea. It makes all sorts of noise. It squeals the tires, and you're at the speed limit in a flash. I mean, it's a lot to handle. So in a lot of ways, you could have more fun with the little Fiat than you could with the Jaguar if you're driving around town, that kind of thing. It's not until you get out on the back roads that you can really safely open a car like that up a little bit more. And even then, you're only tapping into it so much before you're right up to the speed limit. Unless you really are comfortable breaking the law and endangering people, you can't tap into a car like that without taking it somewhere like a track. And it's not even really a track car, so it's got this kind of weird place that it's at. Now anyway, I mention all that because I think it's such a great analogy for martial arts. You have to pick the style that fits your goals and your lifestyle the best. And no one can tell you what that is because everyone's got different goals and lifestyles. So let's talk about the benefits of Taekwondo. What is it really good for? Well, number one, I think it's just a fantastically healthy martial art. Because of its high kicks, its use of so many kicks, you have to be strong in the hips and legs and flexible to do it well. And so there's lots of exercises in your typical Taekwondo classes all about opening up your hips, building flexibility, and building that stabilizing strength, like core strength. These are types of exercises that really help people with back problems and your sort of typical aging aches and pains. So I've had tons of older students who have experienced tremendous health benefits through being involved with just a twice a week Taekwondo program. It's really healthy. It's also high in cardiovascular activity because kicks take a lot of work. I don't know if you've noticed before, but it's more exhausting to throw a kick than it is to throw a punch. Kicks are just a very taxing type of movement. So if you throw a flurry of kicks, you're getting your heart going in no time. And when you're sparring with predominantly kicks, that is a tremendous workout. And I'm not saying that something like boxing wouldn't be. It's all in what you put into it, of course. Just saying that if you were doing a minute of kicking versus a minute of punching, and you're in both cases going full bore, that minute of kicking is going to be a lot harder than that minute of punching from an endurance standpoint. That's all I'm saying. Now, obviously, you could do 2 minutes of punching instead, and you'd have more endurance than the 1 minute of kicking, more endurance training. But point being, you get a little bit more out of that time doing kicks if something like endurance training is your goal. It's also healthy from the standpoint that when you spar, you're not going to get punched in the head. And as you probably all know, head trauma is a very serious issue in martial arts. If you're not well, really, nobody should be experiencing head trauma. You want to minimize it as much as possible. So even if you're a professional fighter, you take every single precaution you can to minimize your head trauma. But definitely if you're not a professional fighter, you're not getting paid to do this stuff, you should drastically try to reduce head trauma. And even though we can kick to the head, it's much harder to kick someone's head than it is to punch it. And when you get new people in off the street who are starting to spar with you, you know, a wild swinger who doesn't have any control yet, they're a lot more likely to hurt you when they're swinging with their hands than with their feet. I am not worried about people coming in off the street and kicking me in the head. If someone came in off the street and they were throwing wild haymakers, that would be a concern for me because, as we all know, it's easy to get a strike through even against a trained person. That there's always that puncher's chance, as they say. So you can do a pretty rigorous form of sparring and stay relatively safe when it comes to head trauma. And speaking of staying safe while sparring, Taekwondo implements a variety of safety equipment that you don't see in a lot of other martial arts, such as chest guard, helmet, shin, instep protectors, forearm protectors, groin protectors. Now, some people might laugh at that and say that's silly, but truly it allows us to engage more rigorously and then jump in and do it again the next day. Whereas if you don't wear a lot of those things, even if you're just getting bumps and bruises, if you go to do it the next day and then the next day and then the next day, it can often exacerbate those things and you never really let your body heal. So there's something to be said for being able to engage pretty rigorously without causing yourself constant body trauma. So it's a healthy practice. That brings me to the sparring itself. A lot of martial arts don't have any form of resistance training. When I did Aikido, I did that for 7 years, there was no point in the practice where we did any kind of resistance training against another person. And resistance training, of course, is where you learn to actually use your techniques. A technique cannot be reliable unless you put it through a form of resistance training. So Taekwondo, if you're talking about your average WT Taekwondo program, you're going to be involved in some sort of sparring, and it's going to be quite regular, and so you'll get very good at using the kicks of Taekwondo in a sparring setting. And you'll also get good at some of those basic punches that Taekwondo athletes also throw. So this is excellent because a lot of martial arts don't have that component at all. And a martial art that has a form of resistance training is always going to be better when it comes to being able to rely on the techniques than a martial art that doesn't. So I might be a little controversial here, but I'll mention something. Let's say you do a really street lethal form of Krav Maga, so you're always practicing things like throw strikes and eye gouges. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. You can practice those things. However, when you're not actually testing it against a live resisting opponent, you don't know if those techniques work or not because you've never actually learned to do them under pressure, and that's what it takes to rely on the technique. So I would rather have a set of skills that are less street lethal, like some kicks, some high kicks from Taekwondo that people say aren't super useful on the street. I'd rather have those if I'm trained in using them against resisting opponents than techniques that are just theoretical. Now, I'm not picking on Krav Maga. I think if you want to do something like that and not involve yourself in resistance training, it's still better than nothing at all. But if you want the technique to be reasonably reliable, then having a technique that's tested through pressure is going to be better than one that's not, even if the technique is lower percentage. So if you're really good at landing jump spinning hook kicks in live sparring, I say even though that's a low percentage technique, that's better than someone who's only ever punched a mitt and never a real person in a sparring situation. So Taekwondo has a great resistance training part of the practice. Now, I also love that Taekwondo has a dual focus. Most physical activities, it's either one or the other. You're doing something chaotic or you're doing something that's highly structured. So let's say you're a gymnast, you're doing a highly structured routine, trying to get your body to be very precise and do exactly what you're instructing it to do. And there's a tremendous value to that sort of body awareness and control and the discipline that comes out of the rigorous training you need to do to get that. So it's a great thing. Now, on the flip side, you've got something like, say, football, where the dynamics are always changing. There's violent clashes. You can't really judge football from the standpoint of how clean was the technique. It's did it work in that setting? Did it get the job done? And it's going to always look a little different because the setting is constantly changing. Now, it's very rare to have an activity where you need to develop both of those pieces. Now, obviously, if you're a high-level athlete, you can kind of choose one route or the other. But every new Taekwondo student on their journey to black belt learns the forms and learns how to spar. And so they're engaged in two very different types of physical training. And I think from a standpoint of developing the mind, approaching a physical activity with those two dualities is really rewarding, and it gives you tremendous physical benefits as well. Another thing Taekwondo has going for it is it's just really accessible. There's a lot of it out there. And so if you're trying to choose a martial arts program, it's better to choose the place that's closer to you, that you're reasonably going to get to regularly, than a place that's like, an hour and a half away. So Taekwondo is much more likely to be near you, and there's more to choose from. So if you don't like the Taekwondo school down the road, you can go down the road the other way, and you might have a better Taekwondo school. So because it's so accessible, you have more odds of running into a quality Taekwondo program than you might with some other martial arts styles that are a little bit harder to find. So accessibility can be a real benefit. The other benefits of things like that is that you have more gear choices, more uniform choices. Because so many people do it, there's a lot more resources out there for students. and there's more people like me making content for you guys as well, because it's just a broader thing that more people study. So its accessibility is great, and that leads me to the next benefit, which is the tournament circuit. Because Taekwondo has an Olympic path, there are many ways to compete in quality run tournaments. And even if they're not affiliated with the USAT, even if they're not going through that Olympic path in our country, at least in the United States, then there's still a lot of good tournaments out there, usually using the same format. And a lot of the tournaments will use the electronic sparring, which is also controversial, but I'm a big fan of it. I've seen both. I lived through both eras. And before electronic sparring, there was just a lot of nonsense that went on with scoring, sometimes deliberate biases. Sometimes I was a judge plenty of times, writing with a pen and paper. And you know, every time someone scores, you have to mark it, and it's really hard to catch two scoring shots at the same time. There's a lot of disadvantages, so even if the judge is trying their best, they may miss something. So electronics is a really nice equalizer in that it takes the bias out and the human error out to a much greater extent. Certainly not without its faults, but I think it's a much better place to be than the pen and paper style. We also have sport pumse, and again, it's controversial. Some people like it, some don't, but I think it's really nice to have a standard that every tournament is going to use in which you judge the pumse by. That makes it a lot easier to teach students how to prepare for a competition, and it makes it a lot easier to explain to them why they won or why they lost. Standards can be a really nice thing to have, and Taekwondo is really great because of the standards. There's going to be very little difference from tournament to tournament, provided they're in the same organization, which is a broad organization in this case. All right, so how about some of the problems with Taekwondo? Well, as you probably know, Taekwondo cannot be everything, and so Taekwondo has a relatively narrow focus, in that you spend a lot of time learning to do your kicks. And when you do work on hand techniques, it's outside of the context of sparring, so you don't get that resistance training with it, and so those hand techniques just aren't going to be super reliable for the students in a standard Taekwondo program where they're just part of the pumse. Now, if you take those techniques and you put resistance training behind them, sure, you can do elbows and knife hands and all kinds of other techniques, but if you're just talking about, again, a standard sort of WT Taekwondo program, you're going to be really keyed in to a specific set of kicks. And not only just kicking, but kicking that's specifically above the belt and targeting the body or head. So that's a very limited area of focus. They do punch, it's not the type of punching you would see in normal sort of combat sports like boxing, MMA. It's not the kind of punching that would cross over too well into those territories. So really you're building a single skill set, which is high kicking. Now, is that bad? No, I mean, it's just going to make you really good at high kicking, just like boxers get really good at punching. So it has its benefit, and then you get tremendously good at that. But of course, being so narrowly focused, you can't expect to take something like Taekwondo and then move into another combat sport like kickboxing or MMA and do well without adding to your Taekwondo program. So if you don't want to just work on kicks a lot, then Taekwondo obviously isn't a martial art for you, because those are the primary toolbox of Taekwondo. On the flip side, if you don't care about fighting and you really like just form movement, then this isn't going to be an issue, because there are lots of hand techniques inside of the forms or pumse that you don't do in the sparring. So if you're not concerned with sparring with those techniques, then this is not an issue. And that leads me into the next potential problem with Taekwondo, which is if you don't care about forms and traditions, you should stay away from Taekwondo, because there are a lot of those. And on your journey to black belt, you're going to have to do lots of forms and learn lots of Korean words. And if that's something that's not up your alley, you just want to get in a ring and fight, then I would not recommend Taekwondo for you. Now, on the flip side, if you really enjoy the body discipline that comes from forms, if you like the historical heritage that comes from doing something that someone else did many years ago, and sort of the feeling of passing down this lineage and learning about the culture, then you're really going to enjoy this component. But if you're really fixated on the fighting side and only the fighting side, and you want the best bang for your buck when it comes to learning how to fight, then Taekwondo is not for you, because half of the training, if you're not just purely focused on sparring, if you're in a standard program, half of the training is going to be about learning these forms and about body discipline and cultural heritage, all of those components that don't carry over into fighting, at least in a format that's the best bang for your buck. I'm not saying it's useless for fighting, only that if you had 2 hours a week to work on fighting and you spent 1 hour doing fighting and 1 hour doing forms, that's not the best route to become a good fighter with 2 hours a week. You can increase the time allotment, the thing remains the same. You want the best bang for your buck if that's your goal, and learning forms is not the best bang for your buck if your only goal is to learn to fight. There are many benefits to doing forms, and I personally really enjoy doing forms. However, it's not going to be your best route for fighting. Another problem with Taekwondo is because it's so heavily focused on the kicks. If you're just someone who is not very flexible and you don't want to constantly be working on building flexibility, you're never going to be an A-level Taekwondo, even student, even like locally in your school, if you don't have a base level of flexibility. You can't perform the kicks in a quality way. So this can be quite discouraging if you're an older person who's really stiff. Unless, of course, your goal is to take Taekwondo to work on your flexibility. If you just want to try to get to the sort of top tier level, even locally in your school, of what you can do with the style, it's going to be very hard for you to do that if you're just naturally a stiff person and not putting a lot of time into the stretching. I did a style called Uechi-ryu karate for a little while, Okinawan karate style. All the kicks are below the waist. That's a perfect style if you want to be able to engage in something that doesn't require this sort of tremendous amount of flexibility. And this leads into another thing, which is your hips. You know, in my case, I have shallow hip sockets, and I've learned that these kinds of high kicks, they don't always agree the best with my hips. And so maybe having known that early on, I may have gone a different route with my personal martial arts journey. Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. But certainly something to consider, that if you have a propensity for hip injury, then all these kicks can maybe exacerbate that. Now, in some cases, they may help. It really depends on what you personally are dealing with. So some people will actually see physical benefits with their hips from practicing the kicks, whereas others might see some degradation like I've experienced. Now, are there ways to work around that? Yes. If I could start over now, I could probably do a lot of these things without agitating my hips so much, using what I've learned through the injury process. And that leads me to the final drawback of Taekwondo, which is that it does still have a chance of injury. So anytime you're sparring or doing jumping motions or higher impact motions, your chances of injury do go up. And even though Taekwondo doesn't have the same level of intensity in its sparring as, say, something like kickboxing might, where you're doing full contact kicks and punches to the body and head and legs and all those things, it's still pretty rigorous. It is full contact. And so if you really don't want to be involved in something where there's any chance of injury, like you're the type of person who purely does exercise for exercise sake alone, like you go, okay, swimming's perfect because there's no impact and I'm still getting some good exercise, then Taekwondo's probably not the best fit for you, because it's very difficult to engage in it, even if you're just like hitting targets and doing that kind of thing, without increasing your chances for injury. You're putting a lot of impact on your joints, you're putting a lot of impact on your body if you're getting hit, and there is still that risk for head injury, even though it's lower than something like boxing would be. Now, it is possible, if you want to spar and not have those higher chances of injuries, you can do a very, very light contact version of sparring. That would be more akin to something like point karate. So if you want to compete in that format, there is still a venue. And then maybe something more like point karate is up your alley rather than the full contact format that Taekwondo uses. So anytime, of course, you increase the rigorousness of your competition type of sparring, the chances of injury will go up. Now, I think Taekwondo strikes one of the best balances of this out there, because you can go full bore and the number of injuries are just very low. When you're not kicking people in the legs and punching them in the head and slamming them to the ground, all those kinds of things just have higher chances of injury. But again, then you lose some of the dynamics, some of the multivariable things that you'd learn from competing rigorously with fewer rules. Well, there you have it. Pros and cons, just like anything else that you're doing. And if you're new to Taekwondo, consider these things. I personally think Taekwondo strikes a great balance, and I think is an excellent activity. And if you really like Taekwondo, but you really want to learn something that will give you a little bit more variables to play with, you can certainly just add on top of it. You know, if you learn, I think a great combination would be Taekwondo and Judo or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because Taekwondo is fantastic from a distance, and then naturally you move into these clinches. I think Judo is great because in the case of Taekwondo, you move into your clinch, you're still standing, and then Judo moves right into its mode of operation where you're working on throwing the person down or breaking out of the clinch. And then Judo, of course, does have its ground game components as well. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of course, being much more geared toward the ground itself. But yeah, feel free to add to it if you don't want to focus on something so narrow. I recommend not trying to take in too much new information at once, but think down the road you can always add to the skill set, and you can use Taekwondo for the benefits that Taekwondo brings. It can be really hard to choose. Just like in the case of cars, one may have more social cred than another, but you have to ask yourself, what is realistic for me? What do I want in my life? And what's around? What's even out there for me to go practice? Then you can choose based on all of those different variables. Let me know about why you chose Taekwondo if you currently do it. And yeah, I'd love to hear that. Leave a comment about why you chose Taekwondo and what you love about the art. Thanks, guys. By the way, I will get back to my standard format instructional videos. I'm just spending a lot of time working on the Taeguk Forms course right now, and it leaves me very little extra time for editing and so forth. So I'm doing these long form videos, which helps me practice that as well. But they don't require much editing, so it gives me time to really key into my upcoming Taeguk Forms course. Almost done. I'm getting close, so I'm putting everything into that right now. Thanks. Till next time.